Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I am happy to be with you for a second time this week, bringing you another author interview. It has been one of those weeks where I cannot for the life of me figure out what day it is. Monday? I had no clue it was Monday. I thought it was later in the week. Today, it's Friday, but I keep thinking it's earlier in the week, so I clearly have no concept of time. My weekends are just blurring together. I don't even know, but that's neither here nor there. That's just my weird brain this week, which is making me very, very confused. I hope your week is going better. I love coincidences, as you know. I love how just random things happen with the way the interviews get scheduled. This week, it is the fact that we have two very different books. We had romantic comedy on Tuesday with The Boyfriend Candidate, and today we are turning to thriller, espionage, military thriller, and they don't have anything in common except for the fact that they both are partially set in Austin. The Boyfriend Candidate was completely set in Austin except for a brief couple of scenes in Houston, and this one starts and ends in Austin, Texas. And I don't know, that's just amazing to me that random authors who just schedule, not haphazardly, but whenever I happen to get their information and the request for the interview, and they go to my scheduling app, and yeah, so two different books, both with Austin connections. Very, very different though. So I don't know, I like those coincidences. I think they're interesting. Maybe you think coincidences are interesting too, or maybe you're just like, whatever, move on. In which case, hey, I'm going to move on. We are talking today, I am talking today, you are listening today, to author Don Bentley. We are talking about the fourth book in his series featuring a main character called Matt Drake. This book is called The Forgotten War. Let me go ahead and give you the description of the book. As a team, Matt Drake and his partner, Frodo, have watched each other's backs through some very dark days. But one thing they've never doubted was their commitment to each other. Until now. Frodo has been accused of a war crime 10 years after leaving Afghanistan. Matt is determined to prove his friend innocent, but what will he do when he finds that his closest friend has secrets he won't share? That is the description of Forgotten War. Tells you enough to probably pique your interest, whet your appetite a little bit, but doesn't tell you a lot. This is, as I said, the fourth book in this Matt Drake series of books featuring Matt Drake. So if you are already a fan of this series, then that's probably plenty enough to pique your interest. If you are just a fan of this type of military espionage thriller kind of book, then this might be enough to pique your interest in a new series. Maybe you haven't read these books and you are excited that there are now 4 of them out that you could read all at once. If you're a long-time listener, you know that every time there's a series that has multiple books in it, I'm like, yes, you can read 4, 5, 3, whatever it is that are already written. You don't have to wait in between the release dates. I mentioned in the interview that these are not often my go-to books. My dad, my brother, my uncle really like these books and have read a lot of different types of books in this specific type of genre. I've read a few. They're not the ones that I usually get straight off the shelf and I'm like, yes, this is my next read. But as you also know, if you're longtime listeners, I have been given the honor of reading a lot of different types of genres and books that I might not necessarily have read had it not been for the podcast. And what I really appreciate about this book, and I assume this whole series, this is the fourth book and it's the first one that I have encountered and read, is that they're very relatable. Sometimes with series like this, it's so much action and it's a little overstimulating for my brain. I think it's a little too much, and I can zone out. But here, the characters are very relatable. Their relationship is very relatable. Within the very first part of the book, you get a very good understanding of Matt and Frodo's relationship, that they are very close, that this arrest is definitely going to affect their relationship, influence the book, of course, and the plot. But also there's humor, and it can be sometimes it's dark, but sometimes it's just regular, normal, everyday humor, which I very much appreciate, because for someone like me who does not read this genre very much, that helps me to enjoy it and engage with it and read probably more in a genre that I don't often read in. So I will definitely be on the lookout for more Matt Drake books. Someday, if my TBR is ever manageable, which we all know it's not, but the first three will go on my list of potential. Hopefully someday I will get to them. And I've already told my brother that he should look into this series because it's right up his alley. Let me stop talking. Let's go now to the interview. So Don can tell you more about the Matt Drake series and his writing in general. Again, the book is called Forgotten War, and the author is Don Bentley. Hi, Don. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Sarah.
Thanks for being here. I am excited to talk to you. Before we talk about the book and the series, if you could start by just sharing a little bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, for sure. So I've done a lot of interesting things. My wife says that I can't figure out what I want to be when I grow up. And I think there's certainly some truth in that. I spent 10 years as a Army Apache pilot. And during those 10 years, I did a 1-year combat deployment to Afghanistan as an air cavalry troop commander. And I also spent a couple years as an FBI special agent and SWAT guy. And then spent my time in the real world, I guess, as it were, working for companies that developed technology for the special operations or intelligence community. So lots of things that all kind of go together and help me write the books that I write.
I was just going to say that same thing. It sounds like you've had a very interesting life, but also a life that is very conducive to the books that you are currently writing. So this is actually the fourth book in a series about a character called Matt Drake. Can you give an overview of the series?
Yeah, so the first book in the series is called Without Sanction. And when that came out, I had an interviewer ask me, "Are you Matt Drake? Am I my protagonist?" And I assured her that I was most assuredly not Matt Drake, but that I had stood in the same room with men who could be. And that is a fact between my time in the Army and the FBI, and then my time, like I said, developing technology for people. I got to spend a lot of my time with folks who could be characters in my book. And so Matt Drake is what's called a case officer for the Defense Intelligence Agency. Case officer is a fancy way of saying he's a spy. His job is to run and recruit what in the intelligence community we call assets. So when I was an FBI agent, we called sources. I actually had a very similar job to Matt's when I was in the FBI, but I worked domestically and he works internationally. And he works, as I said, for the Defense Intelligence Agency. And that's an agency that is very much like or has the same mission set as its much better known brother, the Central Intelligence Agency, except for that it reports, or its job is to generate intelligence through the military. And so many of the folks who work for DIA are former or current military officers or enlisted folks. And so Matt Drake is a former Army infantry officer, and he did his tour duty as a commander in the Ranger Regiment. And so Matt is, like I said, is a little bit different from a lot of the thriller protagonists. When I came to this genre, my editor, who's a fantastic guy named Tom Colgan, who edits both my Matt Drake books and the Tom Clancy books, said that when you're a debut author for genre fiction, what you want to do is something that's the same but different. And the same in that I write books like Brad Taylor or Mark Greaney, so my book should be on the shelves with them, but I'm never going to write a better Brad Taylor book than Brad does. And so I had to make some choices that made Matt and my book series a little different. And so first of all, I write him in the first person point of view, which is kind of just writer talk for saying that Matt is the one who tells you the story. And so I'm a huge Nelson DeMille fan, and he was kind enough to blurb Forgotten War. His John Corey series is a huge influence on my writing. It's about this really funny New York City cop. And when I looked at this genre, there weren't a lot of folks who wrote, first person kind of funny, self-depreciating narrator. And so that's what Matt's like. He's also, like I said, there are a lot of folks running around in this genre who are assassins or special forces folks or CIA operatives. Matt isn't that. He works for the Defense Intelligence Agency. And like I said, his job is to run and recruit assets. And the third choice I made is Matt has a best friend who goes by his radio call sign of Frodo. And Frodo's an African-American former Delta Force operator who got paired with Matt during Matt's first assignment to Iraq. And they've been kind of inseparable since, except for in Without Sanction, you find out that there was a terrible operation that went wrong where Matt and Frodo were hit by an IED, and Frodo was pretty horribly disfigured. And so he can't be Matt's backup from the sense of being an operator anymore, but he's still Matt's best friend. And so the stories are always feature the two of them.
Yeah, actually, when you mentioned first person and kind of funny, that's one of the things that I appreciated about this. This is definitely my father and my brother's genre, not necessarily my go-to genre. But I'm always open for new authors and new stories. But I liked it's dark humor, but it's not as dark as it often can be in books like this. So gray humor, that's not right either. But I appreciate the humor that Matt brings to the series.
No, I appreciate you saying that about the genre too. So my first reader is my wife, and she isn't physically represented in the book, but Matt's wife, Lila, is very, very similar to my wife. And this is not her genre of choice either, but she's my first reader. And I figure if I can hook her, that I'm doing a good job, and maybe other folks who don't normally read this genre might like it as well. And then as far as the humor point, like I said, the men, and in some cases women who could be characters in my book, I found, and I found this when I was deployed in combat too, is that you often cope with what are extremely dire, stressful situations through a sense of gallows humor. And that the people, like I said, the people who I knew who could be in my book, that's how they approached life. And that's part of what I wanted to incorporate in my book, both to show that, and then, like I said, to make it a little bit different from the books that are out there right now.
Right. But it makes it very real, because that is something that you encounter in situations like this. You mentioned Matt and Frodo's relationship, and Frodo, the book starts with Frodo being arrested. I mean, that's quickly.
Yep.
So I'm not giving anything away. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the premise for Forgotten War?
Yeah, absolutely. And so when I sat down to write Forgotten War, it's the fourth book in my series. And as I was writing it in the summer of 2021 was when we were conducting our catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so, as I was watching that happen, as someone who served in Afghanistan, as someone who lost friends in Afghanistan, I was struggling to make sense of what was happening and how to process it. And my friends who were veterans, I kept getting variations of this call or text or email over and over again of, was it worth it? Was anything that we did there worth it? Was the sacrifice, the blood, the treasure, 20 years, did we just waste them? And so I was trying to figure that out. And I think, in a good book, what happens is that the writer is trying to figure something out for themselves in the pages of that book. And so, Forgotten War starts at a bar in Austin. I guess all good books start at a bar, maybe in Austin. And what you see is Frodo and Matt in a bar, and they're watching the news as the Afghanistan withdrawal is happening, and they can't believe what they're seeing on the TV. And as they're sitting there, two Army CID or Criminal Investigation Division officers walk into the bar and arrest Frodo for a war crime that allegedly took place in Afghanistan 10 years prior. And it took place during Matt and Frodo's first tour of duty together in Afghanistan. And so what Matt can't figure out as Frodo gets hauled away is, how could that have happened? Because Matt was with Frodo during the time the crime allegedly took place. And so as he starts to dig, and the other thing he can't figure out is Frodo makes no effort to defend himself, just says, I'm guilty, I'm guilty, I'm guilty. And so as Matt tries to piece together what actually happened, he figures out that the crime allegedly occurred during this hit that Matt and Frodo were doing with a Special Forces A-team on a Taliban compound, and that the men who were with them, the Green Berets who were with them during that operation, have all recently died under somewhat mysterious circumstances. And so Matt realizes that the only person who knows who was standing next to Frodo and knows what happened in the room when the murder allegedly took place is their Afghan interpreter who's still in Afghanistan. And so this prompts Matt to get kind of a ragtag team of veterans together to go to Afghanistan to find the one person who actually knows the truth about what happened. But he's trying to go into Afghanistan as the country is crumbling and as everyone else is trying to get out.
It's time for our first break of this episode. Now that you have a bit more of an understanding of the Matt Drake series, of Forgotten War in particular, when we come back, Don will be talking about how he writes, what he kind of visualizes as he writes. Is it big action movie scenes? How does that work? So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast gives you advice on everything from hair to fashion to skincare products. We'll talk about the latest trends in makeup, hairstyles, and anti-aging remedies. And we'll cover all of the newest fashion trends. If you have an interest in or questions about the beauty trends that might work best for you, the Golden State Media Concepts Beauty Tips Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Don Bentley. We were talking about Forgotten War, book 4 in his Matt Drake series. And I keep catching myself and trying to edit it out, calling Don Matt. So if you hear me say Matt when I should say Don at any point in this interview, I do apologize. I keep mixing up character and author. I don't know if that's an insult or a compliment, but I'm trying to catch them. Let's get back to that interview. Yeah, and it's even when you're just talking about it, it plays in my head like an action movie. When you're writing, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. Do you write kind of in that big, bold action movie kind of way, or is it just how the story plays out because of the genre of the book?
Yeah, a little bit of both. And so I'm a kid of the 80s and loved 80s movies. And so, movies like, Die Hard or Lethal Weapon or, Top Gun, those big cinematic ones that still resonate with us now were deeply influential to me as a kid, as a storyteller, and now as a writer. But the way that I write, writers are usually, and I'll try and keep this quick because my wife tells me that whenever I talk about the writing process, it's kind of like human Ambien. And so I will endeavor not to put anybody to sleep, but that writers are usually grouped into two camps. They're either plotters, which means they know how the story's going to go before they start writing. So they outline. My friend Kyle Mills who up until recently wrote the Mitch Rapp series, is kind of famous for writing 20 or 30 or sometimes 50,000 word outlines before he even sits down to write the book. And then there's the other camp of writers that I fall into that write organically, or we call them pantsers, because you write by the seat of your pants. And what that means is you don't know the story, how it's going to progress until you start writing that first draft. And you're basically telling yourself the story as you wrestle with that first draft. And so I definitely fall into the latter camp.
And there are a few people who are somehow a combination thereof and call themselves plantsers, which I find hilarious. And your spouses are great, aren't they? Because the human ambient, they don't sugarcoat anything.
Shit, one time, Nick Petrie is a great friend of mine. He writes, his first book is called The Drifter, and he's written about this guy named Peter Ash, and they're fantastic books. And one time during COVID, Nick and I were doing a live event together, and my phone started going off, and it was text from my wife saying, "This is boring, move on, nobody cares." So that's what, in addition to being a great first reader, she helps me keep my interviews on track.
keeps you centered, right?
Exactly.
Can you talk a little bit more about Matt as the main character, and what about him is going to resonate with readers?
Yeah, I think what another thing that makes my books may be a little bit the same but different is that the people I know who could be Matt in real life, most of them have families. They have wives, or in some cases husbands and kids, and it's that which keeps them grounded and gives them kind of that anchor back to normalcy that lets them return to that when they're done doing whatever they do overseas. And so what you'll find with Matt is that he's definitely not the James Bond prototype where he is, buzzing from beautiful woman to beautiful woman. He's happily married. He loves his wife. His wife is pregnant. It is that sense of heart, I think, that's a little bit different in my books than a lot in these genre, in that, Matt's heart, Matt's relationship after his relationship with his wife. The second thing that the series is built on, I mentioned before, is Matt's relationship with Frodo. And that was really, really important to me. Like I said, I served 10 years in the Army, and I came from a little town in Ohio. And the first time I ever worked, had a black boss, was in the Army. The first time my wife can make Puerto Rican beans and rice because one of my fellow officers, and who turned into be one of my best friends, was Puerto Rican. And when we moved from one duty assignment to another and didn't have a house, he and his wife took us in for a month, and my wife learned how to make beans and rice because his wife made it for him every day. And it's those kind of things that my wife used to say, whenever you could always tell when you were getting close to an Army installation, because you would see kids out together from all walks of life, all demographics, all religions and stuff. And they were kids that shouldn't have anything in common, but somehow did, because the Army was that melting pot. It was, and especially if you deploy to combat with somebody, it really is, there's a verse in the Bible I like where the relationship between Jonathan and David of Goliath and David fame was described as being closer than brothers, that their relationship was so intense and so visceral because they'd been in combat together, that they were closer than brothers. And I think that has been my experience being in the military, and I very much wanted to show that through Matt and Frodo. And so you have a protagonist. Matt doesn't take himself too seriously. Frodo doesn't take Matt too seriously. And so I try to tell a really great story that keeps you up way late at night and keeps you turning pages much longer than you want to. That's reflective of the men and women that I got to serve with, but also, like I said, gives you maybe something that you don't find typically in this genre.
And I think it helps too, because even in that very first part of the book, right before Frodo gets arrested, this is my first book, so I'm coming in on book 4. You can tell immediately how close Matt and Frodo are. So that sets that relationship up, that gives Matt even more impetus
Yeah.
than throughout the book. How do you think Matt has evolved through the series?
So in the very first book, so I wrote, Without Sanction, like I said, is my first book in the series. And I had written 3 books that didn't sell before Without Sanction. And so when I sat down to write the 4th one, I was doing a lot of soul searching and saying, what should I do differently in this book? And some of that was the same but different stuff that I talked about before. A big thing is, like a lot of folks who have served in combat, I had a day on June 28th, 2005, that things went tragically wrong. And I'd spent a lot of time after that date thinking about it and thinking about what I could have done differently and thinking about the fact that I was still alive and there are people that weren't, and what did that mean? And was that the most significant event, when I was barely 30 years old, and what did that mean for the rest of my life if that was the most significant event in my life and things had gone horribly wrong? And so for Without Sanction, I finally got brave enough, I think, to put in a book the things that kept me up at night, the things I wrestled with. And so when you find Matt in Without Sanction, that operation that I alluded to before in Syria, where an IED permanently crippled Frodo was part of something bigger that happened, in which an asset and the asset's family, Matt's asset, were murdered. And Matt thinks that it's his fault and believes that it's his fault because he made a promise to the asset that he wasn't able to keep. And the man's wife and child and the man himself were all killed because of it. And so where you see him in the beginning of Without Sanction is very much questioning where do you go from here? He's not in the DIA anymore. He can't look at his wife. So Lila is, like I said, is my wife in her heart, but is someone I had the privilege of serving with on the outside, in that she's a mixture of Pakistani and Afghan heritage. And so Matt is at a point where he can't look at his wife because his wife reminds him of his dead asset's wife. And so every time he looks at his wife's face, he sees that failure standing back at him. And so he's in a really, really bad spot as a person, as an operator, as everything. And so as the series progresses, he finds meaning in his life again, and, his wife becomes pregnant with their first child. And so, his priorities definitely shift, and who he is as a person. I think that's one of the hard things, or one of the lines you have to walk, especially in this genre, when you're writing a series, is people come to your books for a certain thing, right? They want to see, when you pick up a Vince Flynn book, you want to see Mitch Rapp do what Mitch Rapp does. But if you write the same scenario over and over again, or if you don't add depth to the series, then it can feel very episodic. And so that's something that I've tried hard to balance. And one of the ways I do that is by having Matt himself kind of grow and change across the course of the series.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. Do you have an arc for the series, or will you just keep writing as long as Matt keeps talking to you?
Yeah, I love that you assume that I would be able to plan out an arc for the series and be able to decide kind of where they go next. I think that falls again in the line of whether you write organically or whether you're plotting. I think for me, I've been very, very blessed from a writing perspective, but also a little bit crazy in that I'm working. So Without Sanction came out in 2020, and I'm actually working on my 9th novel now. So this year I had 3 books come out. I had Hostile Intent from my Matt Drake series, and then my last 2 Tom Clancy books were called Flashpoint, and then Weapons Grade just came out about 2 weeks ago. And I'm now working on my first Mitch Rapp book because I got to take over that series from Kyle. And so that's amazing. But then what happens is you have to write very quickly, and you have to still, as you're writing, say, what is it that interests me that I think can bear the weight of a book? And you have to get really good at figuring that out quickly. Because for me, for the last 2.5 years, like I said, I was on a schedule where I had to write a book and turn it in every 5 months. And so you have to get really good at that. And so one way you can get good at that, I suppose, is, as you referenced, is plotting out the arc of the series and saying, okay, after this book, this is going to happen and this is going to happen. And my mind just doesn't work that way. And so for me, what I try and do before I start a new book every time is read the old ones and say, what strings did I not tug on? You know, what are the questions that are still hanging out there? What are the things that Matt hasn't figured out yet? And I make a list of those things, and usually one or two of them will grab me enough to say, okay, this will be the next book. And so that's kind of how I do it. In 2024, there won't be a Matt book. That'll be I think the only thing that's going to come out will be my first Mitch Rapp book, but I'm certainly don't intend to be done working on him. And you mentioned Matt talking to me, and I always thought that was kind of cheesy when writers would say their characters would talk to him. But I think because I write Matt in first person, and Matt tells the story, his voice always seems very, very close to me. And so when I do sit down to write a book, it's usually I usually don't start with an action scene in mind or a larger premise. I start with something that I feel like Matt wants to say. And that's why my books or my chapters often start with dialogue, because that's how I hear stories, through dialogue. And with Matt's books, it's always Matt who's talking to me.
Sure. Yeah. And you obviously write from a lot of your own experience. What types of research do you like to do for books before you start writing them?
Yeah. So I like I said, I've been really, really lucky that I know many of my friends can be or could be people in my books. And then many of my customers, some of them are people in my books. Like I'll ask their permission and say, hey, can I use you or use your name or something? And sometimes I'll say, can I use that story? Cause you'll go to a customer and have a beer with them, and they start telling war stories, and it's like your internal tape recorder just kicks on. And so my first Tom Clancy book was called Target Acquired. And there's a whole, a plot sequence in there about two Green Berets who are, snipers, and they're in Overwatch over this Shia compound that has a bunch of, Shia cultists in it. They're trying to bring about the end of the world, and Iran has given them a bunch of weapons to let them, stir up trouble and do that. And I have it located in Syria, but that was actually a real thing that happened to a real Green Beret who was a customer and has since become a friend of mine. Now, the real one happened in Iraq, but that's a great example where you just bump into stories, and usually I don't know how it's gonna fit in at first, but you just feel it's like grabbing hold of a live wire. All of a sudden, it's like your blood just hums, and you're like, this is it. This is part of what has to be in this book. And so I do that. I talk to a lot of people. I also read a whole lot of op-eds and editorials and things about, things on technology, I listen to one of my favorite podcasts, radio. He's actually a radio host, but I listen to his podcast. It's a guy named Hugh Hewitt, and he has really interesting people on. And so my third Tom Clancy book was called Flashpoint, and it's centered mainly in the South China Sea and had a scenario in which China was trying to encroach on Taiwan and stuff. And a lot of that research I got from listening to there's a congressman out of Wisconsin called Mike Gallagher, who chairs a bipartisan committee on the Chinese Communist Party. And so he'll come in on once a week and talk about a war game they ran, or, someone who testified in front of the committee or something. And so those things that interest me, and I'm like, okay, that's going to be part of the book. Or I'll also have an email folder that's just called research. When I stumble across the articles that I think are interesting, but they're not right for that book, I'll throw them in that folder. And oftentimes when I sit down to start writing the next book, I'll read through that folder and see if I get any pings over any of those articles or things that have interested me before.
That makes total sense to me, and especially if you actually have a system where you find those things easily. I have lots of ideas about lots of different things that I do not file correctly, and then I cannot remember where they are. And but anyway, time for our second break of this episode. When we come back, Don will be talking about character development and how he creates and develops those characters as he writes. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with Don Bentley about his Matt Drake book, Forgotten War. Let's go ahead and return to that interview. It sounds like your writing style is very fluid and kind of evolves as you write. Is that the same for you for character development? Do you let those characters evolve, or is this one area where you have a really good idea before you start writing?
No, much the former, in that they evolve as I'm writing. Oftentimes I won't even name them as I'm writing. I'll put like XX or something like that and come back, because I'm trying to figure out who they are and what, I have. For me, it's much more like, I think Stephen King uses this analogy in On Writing, but kind of being that archaeologist where you start with a pickaxe at first until you start to uncover those bones, and then you switch down to like a paintbrush to dust off the final skeleton and stuff. That's very much when I start writing. I usually, unless it's the main character like Mitch Rapp or Matt Drake or something, it's very nebulous. And I'm like, I think this is where the story's going and it needs to be told from this viewpoint, but I don't usually really understand the character and have all the nuances about him or her until I'm done with the first draft. And I think that's one of the, writing by and large is a very blue collar job where you sit down, you do the work. It's kind of like making the donuts every day. But I think where the magic happens is that if you're true to that and you write every day and you keep the story in your mind, then your subconscious works miracles for you, and you'll be at the gym or walking the dog or doing whatever, and it's another one of those pings, and you'll realize something about the story or a character or something that you would have never taken it there on your own or never taken it there intentionally. But as you write and parts of that skeleton become clearer, other pieces just start to fall into place. And so it took me a long time to get comfortable with the fact that was my writing style, because it would give me bits of panic that usually struck about 2:00 in the morning, where like, I have no idea where this book is going. I have no idea how all of this is going to tie together. And now I liken it more to, I ran a couple of marathons when I was younger, and, the first one at the 20-mile mark, the wheels just came off and I'm like, this is awful. I'm never going to make it through. And I did. And when I ran the second one, it wasn't any less painful at the 20-mile mark, but I knew that it was going to happen, number one. And I knew I had enough confidence in myself that I could get to the other side. And I think that's how writing is. That, again, I was talking with Nick Petrie about this, and he's like, I don't think it ever gets easier to write a book. Writing a book is like running a marathon, but you begin to have more confidence in your process as a writer and know that, yep, this is the part where I think this whole book sucks and everything I've ever written sucks, and I'm going to, my editor's going to fire me. This is just where I am in the writing process. By the time I get to that finished draft, I'll have several other iterations, and these things will start to come together by then.
Making the donuts is such an 80s reference.
Yes, it is.
Made me smile. Lots of people will get that and lots of people will not. How is it you've mentioned writing the Tom Clancy series, and you've mentioned taking over Mitch Rapp, is that correct?
Yeah, the Vince Flynn Mitch Rapp series. Yeah.
Yes. So how is that to then step into writing something that's already been written by someone else? And how does that process work for you?
Yeah, so I was very fortunate in that I had the same editor for my books and the Clancy books. And the reason why that was good, I have another writing friend who was a Golden Glove boxer. His name is John Deacon. He writes fantastic Westerns. And he said, when you're a boxer, he said, when the purpose of a referee in a boxing match is to worry about your opponent so you never have to. You never have to worry about hurting him. You never have to worry about, holding back. You fight as hard as you can, and it's the referee's job to keep your opponent safe. And I think a good editor is the same way for a writer, in that what you want to do is push the absolute limits when you're writing that draft that you give to your editor, knowing that your editor is going to be the guardrails that brings you back in and keeps the book where it needs to be. And the way that worked for me when I wrote my first Tom Clancy book, Target Acquired, obviously all the protagonists in this genre are somewhat similar. That's why it's genre fiction. But in my mind, part of what helped me separate Jack Ryan Jr. from Matt Drake is that Matt Drake was first person again, so he felt very close to me, and Jack Ryan wasn't. And so I thought, this is going to be no problem. I won't, I have an idea what both should sound like. They won't bleed together. And then I got back my editor's notes on my first Target Acquired, on my first Clancy book. And there were sections where my editor marked up and he said, Jack Ryan Jr. wouldn't talk this way. This is Matt, or you need to dial back the humor here. That is fine in a Matt book. It's not fine here. And at first that really kind of shook me. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? And then after I talked to him about it, I was like, you know what? I will try and adjust for it. But kind of what he said to me is he's like, I don't want you mentally reining yourself in. And he's like, that's my job. I want you to be aware of this and to, to think how you're going to do it differently or not. But I don't want you second guessing yourself as you're writing or going back over or worrying about it. And he's like, that's what an editor's there for. And so having him, he and I did Tom Clancy Weapons Grade that just came out 2 weeks ago, was our 8th book together. And so there's a tremendous amount of trust on both sides that you build when you get to work with a great editor for that long. And so that was super beneficial. One of my friends is Josh Hood, who's a fantastic writer, and he got to write in the Jason Bourne universe. And he describes writing for a legacy series like Bourne or Clancy or Vince Flynn or W.E. Griffin. He said it's kind of like when your dad tosses you the keys to his vintage 1965 Mustang for the first time. And he said, you want to get in that car and drive it absolutely as fast as it'll go. But when you bring it back to the garage, you want to make sure there aren't any new dings or dents in the fender. And so I think that's part of what you're doing is recognizing that there were giants who came before you, whether they were, in my case, Tom Clancy himself or Mark Graney, who wrote in that, or Mark Cameron or Mike, I forget Mike's name right now, that wrote the series before me, but realizing that you only get to do this because other people carried this on before you. With Vince Flynn, Kyle Mills, nobody knew whether anybody would be able to continue the series. And Kyle has now written 9 books in the Vince Flynn, Mitch Rapp universe. And so you want to be thankful and respectful for what they've done. But I think what you also have to do as a writer to keep it from being episodic is to say, what's a patch of dirt that nobody has tilled yet that I can kind of plow up and do something with and make a little bit of this series my own. And so again, having Mark Graney on speed dial, there were many times when I was writing my first Clancy book when I would ask Mark, because Mark both wrote with Tom Clancy, and then after Tom Clancy passed away, Mark was the first writer to take over the series without Tom's input. And Mark wrote both the Jack Ryan Sr. books and the Jack Ryan Jr. books. And so there were many calls or different things that I would have with him and talk to him. And then I did the same thing with Mark Cameron, who was writing in the Tom Clancy world. There are 2 books in that universe that come out every year, written by 2 different authors. And so it brings like another level of complexity because you have to coordinate with the other writer who's using some of the same characters and figuring out what he's doing and how that affects you and vice versa. And so I think it's equal parts that where you want to come to the series as a fan and having an idea of because my editor said, what I want you to do is not try and write like Tom Clancy. He was a once in a generation talent. Nobody can write like him. I want you to write fan fiction in the universe that he created. And so I think to do this well, you have to be a fan of the series first and then kind of have those ideas of wouldn't it be cool if, and bring that to the series at the same time being respectful of what the original author and then any subsequent authors have done before you.
I would imagine that thinking of it in that way, kind of writing fan fiction might help alleviate some of that potential imposter syndrome. Yeah,
absolutely. Because it is, if you go back, I made a conscious effort when I came to the Clancy universe to go back and read my favorite Tom Clancy book, and I kept a little notebook and I just titled it "Cool Things That Tom Did," and I would write down things because I wanted to remember as a fan, what did I love about this? But then the hard part is looking at that and saying, okay, what of those things am I actually capable of doing as a writer? And what would, if I attempted, I know would fall flat because only Tom can do that. So I'll give you an example. And I believe it's Dead of Honor. There is a section in which Tom Clancy explains the inner workings of a nuclear bomb in a way that only Tom Clancy can do. And if memory serves, he actually makes you an electron or flowing through the wires of this nuclear weapon and telling you everything that's happening as you do it. And he does it in a way that is captivating, that doesn't make you realize he spent 30 pages describing that. If I tried to do that, if you think my writer's process, human ambient, is bad, I know that I could never pull that off. And so that was on the list. Hey, he does that really well, but I'm not even going to try that. And I think that's part of the balance you have to walk as a writer working in legacy series.
Yeah, I would imagine. We've talked about a few different things that you work on as a writer. Are there any other writings that you want to make sure you highlight during our time together?
No, like I said, this year's been really fun. So we talked about Forgotten War. That is the fourth book in my Matt Drake series. It's certainly the most personal to me as someone who served in Afghanistan. But it is it's first and foremost designed to be a great story. And I think as a writer, especially a writer writing in genre fiction, like your readers are coming to you to be entertained, not to be preached at. And that's not to say that your fiction can't communicate a message or you can't have a thought-provoking theme. But I think if you as a writer start with, here's the thing I want to hit my reader over the head with, rather than here's the great story I want to tell them, I think the readers will notice that, and I think your book will not be as good because of that. And so I think hopefully with Forgotten War, I walk that line where first and foremost it's just a great story. It's going to keep you up way too late at night.
Time for our final break of this episode. When we come back, Don will be talking about what made him decide that he wanted to write for publication. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Don Bentley. And you've done a variety of different things in your life. So what was the impetus then that just made you decide, you know what, I am going to try to write for publication?
Yeah. So I always wanted to be a writer. I think when I started off wanting to be a storyteller, and I remember in elementary school writing fan fiction. Back then, the old Star Trek series was on it would come on whatever at 5:00 every day or something like that. And I remember watching them with my dad whenever my mom was off doing something and would leave us to have dinner on our own. And I remember sitting down and thinking, man, it would have been cool if they would have done this instead, and writing like my takes on those episodes, kind of writing fan fiction for it. And so I started writing my first book, or my first attempt at a book, when I was in high school, and didn't get too far. I really didn't understand the structure of a novel or something, but I had a great teacher my senior year in high school, my AP English teacher. And she, after we had some class assignment to write a scene or write something of conflict or something like that. And she took me aside and said, hey, I think you could actually do this. I think you could be a writer. And so I took that encouragement to heart and went to college and majored in electrical engineering, as all good writers do. But I kept trying to write on the side. And so my first book I wrote while I was still in the Army. My second book I actually wrote while I was deployed to Afghanistan. And so when we would get back from missions and everybody else would play video games or watch movies or do whatever you could do that for downtime, I would pop open my laptop and work on my book. And so those were never, folks look at my career and assume at one point I thought, you know what, now I'm going to give being a writer a try. I was trying to be a writer. I've tried to be a writer my entire life. And it wasn't until, I wrote 3 books over 17 years that didn't sell, until I wrote Without Sanction, that did. And even then, very few writers can afford to write full time. And I remember talking, Brad Taylor and Mark Graney were both very generous with their counsel on this, but Mark Graney in particular said, in this business, what'll typically happen is you'll have the work before you'll have the money, and you'll have to make a bet on yourself. Do I think I can continue to write at this pace, or I can't because my day job and my writing job are no longer compatible? And he said, you'll have to take a bet on yourself at some point, but don't go full-time writing until you absolutely can't do your day job anymore. Because once that thing that was your side hustle is now the thing that's paying the mortgage, it adds an entire another level of stress to something you already need to be very, very creative in order to do well. And so I was fortunate enough when I got the opportunity to write both the Clancy books and my books financially. I could see there was a path that I could stop my day job and become a writer and be full-time, but I had never in my head thought, at this point, I'm going to switch from this job to being a writer. Writing was just what I did. It was what I did on my, in my spare time. It was kind of my side hustle. And I was fortunate enough, that it became my day job, but that it's very, very rare, to be a writer who's able to support themselves by writing.
Yes, it is. But it sounds like you got some good advice from fellow writers. What advice would you then give to someone who was either just starting out writing or, let's just say aspiring authors?
Sure. Yeah. So when somebody, tells me they want to be a writer, especially for genre fiction, what I tell them is you have to read a lot and you have to write a lot. And the first question I ask them, they say, hey, I want to write mystery novels, or I want thrillers or romance books. I ask them, I say, what are the 3 best-selling books in that genre right now that your book should be shelved next to? And if they can't answer that question, it gives me a little bit of pause. And the reason why I say that is genre fiction, you're building a product for a very specific customer. So for instance, if you can have someone who loves romance books and loves military thrillers, but their expectations for a romance book are vastly different from a military thriller. And so if you don't read in the genre you're trying to write in, you don't know what your customers expect to see. And so that doesn't mean you need to follow all the conventions. You certainly don't. But just like with grammar, you have to know the rules in order to be able to break them well, right? Because if you're going to write, you have to know that a paragraph typically doesn't have just one sentence if you're going to write a paragraph with one sentence, because the reason why you're breaking that rule is to draw attention to something, to be different, not be out of ignorance. And so if you haven't read and can't answer questions like that, then I don't know that you're going to be very successful as a genre fiction writer, because your readers have expectations. Now, they may not be able to voice them. So for instance, when my second or third book didn't sell, that same guy, John Deacon, and I were walking through a mall, and there was a bookstore, and this tells you how long ago this was. And he said, let's go into the bookstore. And we did. And he asked me that question: what are the 3 books that are bestsellers right now that yours should be shelved with? And I pointed to 3 books, and he said, let's pull them down and read the first chapter. We read the first chapter, and each of those books either had a body in the first chapter, a weapon being shown, or a weapon being used. And so he looked at me and he said, does your book have that? And it didn't. And so that's not to say that a reader would read mine and say, nobody gets killed in this first chapter, I'm not reading this anymore. But what they might say is, the pacing on this book just seems really slow. Like I couldn't get into it. That didn't grab me, right? And so what they're saying is that they have been conditioned by the genre fiction they read to expect a certain thing in the first chapter. And if you're a writer who doesn't know that, you can break that rule if you have a reason for doing it. But if you're breaking that rule out of ignorance because you haven't done your homework and haven't read in your genre, it's going to be really, really hard for you to make that product, because that's what your book is in commercial fiction. It's a product for a customer. It's going to be really hard for you to make a product that customer wants to buy. The second thing is it's really, really hard to be a good writer or to get better as a writer if you don't write every day or many of the days. I've had friends who I just write on Saturdays, and maybe that works for some people, but writing, you get better at it by doing it. It's the same thing as being, I was a kid of the 80s, like I said, and Michael Jordan was the guy that everybody wanted to be, the athlete that everybody wanted to be growing up. And I can't imagine that Michael Jordan only practiced free throws on Saturday. I bet he could practice free throws for 8 hours on Saturday straight, and he still wouldn't be as good as if he did it 1 hour a day for 8 days in a row. And writing's the same way. It's iterative. You get better at it by doing it. I don't know that you can get better at it by doing it at long stretches of time. I think you got to do it every day. And that's, again, where kind of that magic is, where you do it every day, your subconscious then starts doing work for you.
Thank you. And so, reading in your genre, yes, very important. When you take time to read just for you, what genres and authors do you turn towards?
Yeah, so I don't read for pleasure. I don't read as much in my genre anymore because I get asked a lot to do blurbs and stuff, and so I read other people's books. Or there's some things, great minds think alike or whatever. But I know Brad Taylor's doing a book on China, and as much as I love Brad Taylor, I think I'm going to write a book on China, and so I don't want to read his because I don't want to be duplicative, either intentionally or not intentionally. I've always, for the longest time, I still love fantasy. And for a while, I thought I might want to write fantasy books instead of, military thrillers or espionage thrillers. And I went back and forth on that. For my money, I really like urban fantasy too. And I think Jim Butcher, he has a series called the Harry Dresden Files, and he writes tension better than 99% of the thriller writers I read. And it's fantasy, and it's urban fantasy, and has wizards and werewolves and vampires and everything. But every one of his chapters cranks down the tension on his protagonist, makes things hard. And you can just watch as he constantly increases tension and constantly draws the reader back in. And so he's a great storyteller and a fantastic writer. I also really I'm not big on police procedurals, but I like law books about lawyers a lot. I love Michael Connelly's Lincoln Lawyer series. He is, like I said, lots of people love his Bosch books, and they're great books. I just don't like police procedurals, but I love his Lincoln Lawyer books. And so whenever he comes out with a new one, that's always a happy day for me.
Thank you. If people want to find out more about you and your writing and your books, etc., can you give website and any social media that you're active on?
Yeah, absolutely. And I always love when readers reach out to me. You can find everything I'm working on at my website, and it's donbentley.books.com. So just BENTLEY books.com. And you can sign up for my newsletter there. I've got all the books I'm working on, everything I'm doing. And you can also contact me via email through the website. I'm also on social media. And so I'm primarily on Twitter, but also on Facebook and Instagram. And so my handle for all three of those is at Bentley Don B. So at BENTLEYDONB. So I would love it if you stopped by and said hello.
All right. Thank you again. We've talked about a few different things today, but is there anything that we have not covered that you wanted to make sure you highlighted during this time?
No, I think that's it. I really appreciate you having me, Sarah.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me especially about the Forgotten War and the Matt Drake series, but everything else we talked about as well. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you once again to Don for joining me to talk about Matt Drake and this series, as well as his work writing the Tom Clancy books. I tried not to get too derailed with that subject. I knew going in that he was the current writer of the Tom Clancy series, and because we were talking about his character, Matt Drake, the series that he has developed, I did not want to just completely fangirl about Tom Clancy. Now, as I said, this is not my genre, so I don't read them, but my dad, my brother, and my uncle have read Tom Clancy for years. There have been Tom Clancy books in my house forever, growing up and into adulthood, obviously. So when I saw that he was the current writer, I just had a moment of, oh my gosh, I so wish I could tell my dad about this. And remember at the end of the last episode, I said, the other coincidence besides Austin for this week's episodes is connections with my dad, right? And I called my brother after the interview with Don and told him about it, but I so wish I could tell my dad about this. He would have just been tickled pink. And he would have thought it was so cool. So, Don, thank you for letting me go off on a bit of a tangent. I hope it wasn't too much. Thank you for continuing to write this series and giving me a little bit of nerdy cachet with my brother and my uncle, and with my dad. He would have loved it. So, if you are a fan of this type of genre, of these kinds of action, thriller, espionage, military, all those kinds of things, then you should definitely check out the Matt Drake series. As I said at the beginning, there are 4 currently out, so you have 4 books that you can jump right into and have lots of reading. And, if you are someone who's not necessarily a fan of this particular genre, I would say this is a good series to start with because I really like Matt as a character. I like the relationship between Matt and Frodo. There's action, yes. There's not a lot of oh my gosh, gore. There's obviously, again, action and some things happen that are mildly discomfiting, but it's a good one to jump into, I think, if you have ever wondered about this type of genre. So you might want to try it. Maybe it'll be your cup of tea. Maybe not. But hey, you'll have tried a new genre. So hop in there. Order these books if you are at all interested. Thank you again to Don. Thank you always to you, my listeners. I hope you'll join me for the next episode. We're switching gears again. Romantic comedy to action, adventure, thriller to now nonfiction. I'll be talking with Robert Hoeffler about his book, The Way They Were. The Way They Were, which is the title of the book. It's about the movie The Way We Were. So play on words. Robert Redford, Barbra Streisand. Maybe you've watched the movie. Maybe you're a fan. Maybe you don't know much about it. But we will be talking about that movie, the making of that movie, the roles that people had, why it came to be, etc. All of that good movie history and trivia, etc. So join me for that interview next week on Tuesday. I'm looking forward to talking to Robert. In the meantime, if you are a fan of this podcast and would like to help me get it out to more listeners and readers such as yourselves, as always, follow, subscribe on whatever platform you're listening, leave a review, written, starred, Anything helps. And also, please follow on social media. The podcast is on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. And I say it every week because it's true. I love hearing from listeners. So come find the podcast on social media and hit me up with random questions. I'll do my best to answer them. Hope you are having a great end of your week now, since it's Friday. Hope you've got something fun planned for this upcoming weekend. But regardless of what's going on, I hope that your week and your weekend afford you plenty of opportunities to get yourself lost in plenty of good books. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.